Every civilization has been shaped not only by kings, generals, and philosophers, whose names dominate history books, but also by women who thought, wrote, questioned, imagined, and resisted. Their voices often had to travel through silence, prejudice, and exclusion before reaching the world. And yet, across centuries, those voices survived. From ancient poetry to modern political philosophy, from intimate confessional verses to profound reflections on human freedom, women had expanded humanity's understanding of love, justice, identity, suffering, and freedom. To trace their journey is to trace the evolution of human thought itself. In the ancient world, long before most philosophical schools even allowed women to participate in intellectual life, a poet from this island of Lesbos was writing about the deepest experiences of human soul. That poet was Sappho. Her surviving fragments are delicate and incomplete, yet they contain an extraordinary emotional intelligence. Through them, we see that philosophy does not always begin with systems and theories. Sometimes it begins with the articulation of human feelings. Sappho transformed personal emotion into universal truth. Centuries later, poets like Emily Dickinson and Sylvia Plath would continue this tradition of turning the inner life into poetry. Dickinson wrote quietly in isolation, crafting poems that explored death, hope, and eternity. Plath, with fierce honesty, revealed that fragile tensions between identity, suffering, and creativity. In a different cultural context, Maya Angelou transformed poetry into a voice of resilience and dignity. Her words carried the weight of historical injustice, yet also the possibility of renewal. And in Russia, Anna Akhtamova wrote poetry that stood as witness to oppression and suffering. Together, these poets remind us that poetry is not merely aesthetic expression, it is often a form of moral testimony. As the centuries progressed, women began to shape not only poetry, but the great tradition of novel. In the early 19th century, Jane Austen quietly revolutionized literature. Through novels like Pride and Prejudice, she revealed the hidden structures of social life, class, marriage, reputation, and moral character. Her works demonstrated that the ordinary interaction of daily life contain profound philosophical insights about human judgment, morality, and social order. Soon after, Mary Shelley introduced one of the most powerful philosophical questions of modernity in Frankenstein. What happens when human ambitions exceeds moral responsibility? Her novel anticipated debates that today concerns biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and scientific ethics. Later, Virginia Woolf transformed literature again by exploring the interior landscape of consciousness. In essays like A Room of One's Own, she argued that intellectual creativity requires not only talent but social freedom and material independence. Coming to the 20th century, writers like Toni Morrison and Margaret Atwood expanded literature into a deeper exploration of history, power, and identity. Morrison examined the psychological legacy of slavery and collective trauma, while Atwood imagined dystopian futures that warn us about fragility of freedom. Though their works, literature began not merely storytelling, but a moral exploration of society itself. While writers explored the society through narratives, philosophers began to challenge the deeper intellectual structures that shaped civilizations. One of the earliest voices of this struggle was Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of Rights of Women in the 18th century, at a time when women were excluded from education and public life. She argued that women are not naturally inferior, but are simply denied opportunities for intellectual development. Her argument was radical because this challenged centuries of philosophical assumptions. 2 centuries later, Simone de Beauvoir would deepen this insight in the second sex. Drawing on existentialist philosophy, she famously argued that womanhood is not merely a biological condition but a social construction shaped by historical power relations. Her work fundamentally transformed modern feminist thought. Meanwhile, Hannah Arendt was analyzing the terrifying political realities of 20th century. After witnessing the rise of totalitarian regimes, she wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, offering one of the most profound analyses of political power, ideology, and mass society. Arendt reminded us that political evil is often not monstrous but disturbingly ordinary, what she called a banality of evil. Talking of contemporary philosophy, thinkers like Martha Nussbaum and Judith Butler have continued this intellectual journey. Nussbaum's work on capabilities approach has reshaped global debate about human development, justice, and dignity. Butler's theories of gender have challenged deeply embedded assumptions about identity and social norms. Together, these philosophers expanded the horizon of moral and political thought. This global conversation also finds powerful expression in India. The poet and freedom fighter Sarojini Naidu used poetry to celebrate both beauty and national awakening during the struggle for independence. The Punjabi writer Amrita Pritam captured the pain and trauma of the partition in the Indian subcontinent, giving voice to millions of who experienced displacement and loss. Mahashweta Devi wrote passionately about marginalized tribal communities, exposing social injustice and structural inequalities. Through autobiographical honesty and poetic intensity, Kamla Das explored identity, desire, and personal freedom. And in contemporary times, Arundhati Roy has combined literature and political critique to examine questions of democracy, development, and social justice. These voices demonstrate the Indian literature in not only a aesthetic but also deeply intertwined with social consciousness and ethical reflection. When we look at these women together across centuries, we see more than a collection of writers and thinkers. We see an intellectual lineage. Each voice addresses a different dimension of human condition. Yet, together, they form a single conversation about what it means to be human. The history of these women thinkers teaches us something profound. Ideas do not belong to one gender, one culture, or one civilization. They belong to humanity. For centuries, women had to fight simply for the right to think, write, and speak publicly. Yet, despite these barriers, their contributions have transformed philosophy, literature, politics, and culture. Their legacy reminds us that intellectual progress is not merely about discovering new ideas. It is also about expanding the circle of voices that are allowed to participate in the search for truth. To read these women is not simply to study literature or philosophy. It is to encourage to think independently, to encourage to challenge established power, to encourage to transform personal experience into universal insight. Their works reminds us that the human mind is capable of extraordinary depth and beauty, regardless of the social constraints placed upon it. Across centuries, across continents, across languages, these women have contributed to humanity's most important project, the search for truth, justice, and meaning. And because of them, the intellectual history of the world is richer, wiser, and more humane. Thank you.